2026 is the campaign to protect rural England's 100th birthday. We've been around 100 years protecting the countryside, but the countryside, let's be honest, needs more protection and regeneration perhaps now than it has ever done in the past. The challenges feel big, they feel urgent and very, very complicated. Now, this webinar series gets right to the heart of the truth, which is that climate change is the greatest threat to the countryside that we love and depend on. So we've heard in this webinar series the information about global trends and tipping points, the role of institutions like the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, and some of the information that we have to do, some of the stuff we have to do in order to shift the dial, mitigating harm as well as adapting to the change that's already baked into our planetary systems. Now we get to the crunch of things, which is we might know what to do, but then how do we actually make ourselves do it? How do we empower people to act? How do we demand change from our leaders? How do we make and ensure that people feel like their part in this story counts for something? How, ultimately, do we turn public concern into citizen action and secure the future that we all need? So we've got 4 incredibly impressive speakers today to get into the heart of this and really try and understand what makes a powerful story something that actually inspires action. Rachael Orr is the Chief Executive of Climate Outreach, who help people and organisations tell new climate stories. Sofie Jenkinson is the founder of Round Our Way, an organisation which amplifies the voices of those who are often overlooked in climate discussions. Dominque Palmer is an award-winning youth climate justice advocate, global speaker, writer and artist. And Andrew McRobb is a clean water citizen scientist, active conservationist and a trustee of CPRE Herefordshire. I'm so excited to have you all on the panel today, and thank you so much for joining us for this CPRE session. Folks at home, what we're going to do is we're going to hear now from Rachael from Climate Outreach. Then we'll open up a panel. We'll hear from Sofie, from Dominque and from Andrew. Then we'll have a group discussion and I'll bring in your audience questions. So as things come up for you, by all means, chat to each other in the chat. But if you want to ask a question for our panellists to answer, then, like I said, stick it in the Q&A function. And then we will wrap at 8 o'clock. OK, so I'm going to hand over now to Rachael. Thank you so much, Rachael, and over to you.
Thank you, Marianne. It's a real pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me to take part in a brilliant event this evening and what has clearly been a really, really fascinating series of kind of presentations to mark your 100th year. This is always the most nerve-wracking bit when I make sure that my slides share. So here we go. I'm going to assume that's working, and if not, Marianne's going to wave wildly at me and tell me that it's not. Super, 2 thumbs up. I'm Rachael. I have the immense pleasure of leading Climate Outreach. And we are a team of kind of communicators, campaigners, social scientists. And we think about how do we listen to people, listen to different people from different backgrounds, different political persuasions, who have different views and opinions, both through kind of community engagement, through big pieces of research. And then how do we use that to build up a bank of kind of insights about what people think and feel and know about climate and nature? And then we try and turn that into kind of advice, support and guidance for organisations across the country, governments, charities, businesses, to help them think about the climate stories that they are telling and how those might shift, how we could maybe change some of those based on the kind of insights about what we know people think and feel about climate in the UK right now. So I'm going to give you a bit of an overview of some of the kind of work that we've done. I'm going to go a little bit into how we can build trust as climate communicators. Like, everybody on this webinar is giving up their sunny evening to come and join this conversation. Like, you have an incredibly important role to play as a communicator and a storyteller about climate and nature. I'm then just going to give some headlines from a big piece of research that we did at the end of last year called Britain Talks Climate and Nature, which was a survey with over 7,000 people across the country and a number of focus groups. So what did we find and what do we think that means for the climate story we need now? So to kick off, climate outreach, we're nowhere near as established and experienced as CPRE at 100, but we were 20 last year. And I think when you look back at the work that we've done kind of over that 20 years, research that we've conducted, research that other people have conducted, both on kind of specifically communicating about climate, but actually when we think about kind of good communication and kind of skilled communication on other key issues as well. I think there are three really, really important things that we often maybe don't think enough about in terms of kind of what we should always remember in our communications. The first is, for most people, facts matter a lot less than we think. For people who are really passionate, really knowledgeable about a topic, it's really easy to collect a whole load of facts. And for other people who are equally kind of passionate and knowledgeable, sometimes trading in facts is really important. When you're having conversations with policymakers, it's really important. But actually, kind of out in the real world, people don't connect with facts. Facts are hard to visualize. They're hard to think about what they look like. And actually more and more now, people can be really kind of distrustful of them. But still, we put them all over the place. Campaigners put them in press releases, government churn them out every day. But actually, what we are, as we all know, we're social animals. We connect with stories about people. And most importantly, we connect with stories of people like us. So we want to know not just about the facts and the numbers that we can't quite envisage or we can't quite sort of kind of think about what it means. We want to know what it means for my son, my neighbour, the head teacher at my school. So how can we think more about the stories and the connections with people's heart and emotions and less about the facts that we're really desperate to throw out in our storytelling? And the other big important thing that always comes through is this point about trust. So I think when we think about communication and when people think about the kind of science of communication, people obsess about the message. The message is really important, thinking about how you craft a message, thinking about how that message might be more impactful for different people. But actually, we often don't think enough about the messenger. Who is saying it? Who do we connect with? Who do we trust? In a couple of weeks, we are going to be celebrating the centenary of probably our greatest ever climate communicator, Sir David Attenborough. And whenever you do research, whenever you do focus groups, and you say to people, who do you trust most to talk to you about climate and nature? He's always the person who is kind of front of mind. But actually, the next thing people say is, it's my mate or my dad. Or so how do we as communicators think about how we can build trust and connection with people like us, and maybe with people who've got views that are slightly different to ours, and use that as the foundation for our climate storytelling? This webinar is entitled Making Climate Change a People Story. What do we mean by that? So this is what climate outreach means, because we talk about it a lot. And I think for a long time, climate change was told as a science story. This is about degrees of warming, often about degrees of failure. It's about technical terms that people can't kind of connect with. And actually what we need to do, if we're going to do all of the things that we know we need to do, if we're going to try and get ahead of all of the really quite terrifying science that you've clearly heard of in the last couple of webinars, we have to make this a people story. We have to find ways to connect with as many people as possible, with everyone, and ensure that this is a story about all of us. We need to change our story from just telling everybody that the damage is done. Now, that is not to say that we shouldn't talk about the really scary facts. We should. But what we can't do is just leave people with the terror and the horror, because actually what most people do then is they switch off. If you give people something really worrying, most people just think, thanks, I don't want to really hear very much more about that. So what we need to do is we need to keep talking about the reality and about how bad this could be, but make sure we're balancing that and always including messages about we're all part of what happens next. Yes, this is bad. Yes, it's going to get worse, but there are things that we can do and we're all part of it, and this is how we do it. We need to move from a viewpoint from a lot of kind of expert climate communicators that people don't understand, and we need to educate them. They do. People across the country know about climate change. They're worried about it. They see the climate changing all around them. But actually, what they need to know is, what do I want to do? Where's the leaders I can follow, whether they're leaders in my neighbourhood, whether they're leaders in my workplace or political leaders. I want to know what they're doing and what I can do to be part of what we need to do to tackle this big, scary thing that we know is going to affect all of us and affect our children and our grandchildren. We need to move away from a story that leaves people thinking, what can I do in the face of such an enormous challenge? What can people really do? To not just a story which says, here's some things you can do, but actually let's look at what people are already doing, because then it feels easier. It feels more natural. It isn't a thing that we haven't started tackling yet. We hear that a lot when we go and do research with people. People are like, well, I don't know about any progress that we've made. And when you tell them about things like, putting solar panels on roofs, when you tell them about changing up our energy mix, they're excited and they want to hear more about it. So we need to move away from a sense of people just feeling this is paralyzing, it's too big, to there are already loads of people doing things. Here's how you can join them. So if those are some kind of principles for the kind of stories and the engagement that we need, how do we, as people who are passionate and caring about this, think about our role? How are we kind of being the most effective climate storytellers that we can possibly be? We did a big piece of research about 18 months ago about trust. And it was sparked by a conversation that one of my team had with a community kind of workshop he was running. And someone who was there said to him, why is it that loads of people will believe the kind of scaremongers more than they'll believe climate scientists? Like, I can't get my head around that. So we did a whole load of different kind of testing of different messengers. We showed people lots and lots of different interviews that different people had done and tried to kind of tease out, why are some people more compelling? Why do some people connect with you better than others? And we found that to be a really effective communicator on climate and nature, we need to try and do three things. So we need to show passion. That passion can be really personal, right? Why does this matter to you? What has made you, feel worried or scared or want to get involved in what is happening to address climate change? You need some credibility, but that absolutely doesn't need to mean you're a climate scientist. It needs to mean this is what I'm already doing, right? I am passionate about growing food locally. What I'm doing is I'm part of a community allotment group. Brilliant. There's your passion. There's your credibility. I'm with you. I want to hear more about you, what you've got to say. The final thing we need to think about is empathy. And in my experience, this is where some climate advocates or activists can occasionally fall down. And that is often in a huge part to do with their deep drive and deep passion for this issue. But what we can sometimes fail to do is understand where our audience is coming from. Actually, what are the things going on in their lives? What are the other things that they're worried about? Can we do some listening, but also have some nods in our communication that we really understand what their life is like? Quite often when I go and run research, I will say to people, what do you expect from somebody who is here to kind of talk to you about climate change? And people will say, you're going to make me feel guilty about things I don't do, and you're going to tell me to do more, or tell me to stop doing things that I like getting on planes and eating meat. And if that's how people think that kind of climate, like passionate people are turning up into a conversation, it's hard for them to build that trust. So how do we think about the kind of empathy with our audience in all of our climate storytelling? So the other thing we get asked about, especially kind of at the moment, is like, does this all still work right now, right? Talking about climate change can feel a bit more challenging and a bit more contested than it maybe has done in the past. So as I said, we did a big piece of research last year called Britain Talks Climate and Nature to really kind of get under the skin of what was happening in terms of what people think and feel about climate and nature in 2025, 2026. And the research that we do, we use an audience segmentation model. I'm not going to get into deep research methods, don't worry. But basically what we do is we kind of think about people in one of 7 groups, one of 7 segments. And those 7 segments are kind of defined not by people's demographics or their politics, but by their values. It's a audience segmentation we work on with a research agency called More in Common. And these are the 7 segments that are on this slide. We'll share all these slides after, so you can have a good look at these. And it shows also the different kind of proportions of people in those different segments. The red tranche here, the rooted patriots, are quite often kind of representative of people in working class communities, who I know Soph's going to talk a bit more about shortly. And what we try to do is show where there are similarities in how these different audiences think and feel and engage with climate and nature, and where there are some differences. You know, where if you're talking to the progressive activist audience, who are really fired up, really want to kind of believe in like political change, that might be different to how you might talk to, say, someone in the traditional conservative segment, still really care about climate and nature, but are probably less engaged in the kind of radical politics and think much more about in kind of terms of like, how do we respect the planet? How do we kind of respect nature for future generations? So we try and think about what are the things that unify, what are the ways that really connect with all of these segments, with everybody, but also where might there be some kind of differences and some things that we might want to dial up and dial down when we're thinking about engaging with different people about climate and nature. What did we find? What did we find in this research? Overwhelmingly, we find that people are worried about climate change. And that they're really passionate about preserving and protecting nature. We are a nation of nature lovers, and we want to keep on doing our bit to protect the things that we love. So we asked people the words in the red word cloud over here. We gave people a free text box and said, in a word or two, how do you feel when you think about climate change? And then in the blue words, we said to people in a word or two, think about the impact that people are having on kind of nature and the environment. So, you know, the kind of scale of sort of worry and concern comes through really strongly. 3/4 of people are saying to us they're worried about climate change, and that they think it's really important that we have ambitious action on addressing climate change. We asked people kind of, what are you worried about? So if you think about climate change, what impacts are you most worried about in the next 10 years? And as you can see, this table is arranged by everybody in the kind of grey column, and then it's listed by the different audience segments, which is kind of what I mean. There are some things that are more of a concern for some groups than others. But as you can see, the kind of harm to nature and wildlife is the top concern for pretty much every segment. And where it's not, it's the second one. So, you know, this is the way most people think about climate change. They don't think about, sort of gas and degrees and emissions. They think about nature, and they think about wildlife, and they think about rivers and parks and mountains. So that's the way we need to kind of build our connection with people when we're talking about climate, and we're talking about protecting the things we love from the impacts of climate change. We also found, and this will be a surprise to nobody who's had kind of conversations with any like friends, neighbours in the last couple of years, the mood in lots of the country, like, it feels hard. There's a real decline of trust in kind of politics, in big institutions, in governments and politicians of pretty much every stripe. And so when we talk to people about climate change, like it's viewed through that lens. We said to people, what world do you think future generations will inherit? And like as a mom of two kids under 10, when the words that are coming up most strongly are worried, uncertain, frustrated, conflicted, like that's really scary, that, you know, but that's how people feel. They don't see that their children will have better prospects than their parents did. And I think that's probably the first time in many generations that that's how people have felt. And that rubs off in terms of how people feel about not climate change itself, but like a government's ability to act and to do the things that we need them to do at the scale that we need them to do. And certainly we heard much more about people saying, oh, you know, did the governments have like a vested interest? And these kind of net zero policies are sort of felt like they're being imposed on people. And we have to really think about what that means for kind of listening and engaging with people and letting them feel part of what the kind of green transition and moving towards a lower carbon future looks and feels like. But resoundingly, we found that we have a really brilliant opportunity to kind of flip the script. I find myself in quite a lot of meetings at the moment where concerned climate advocates and activists talk about the fact that we're losing. We're really not. Like, you know, 3/4 of people say that they're really worried about the issue that we're really trying to kind of advocate for and campaign about. Everybody can tell you why they're worried about an element of, you know, the climate changing or a thing that they care about, you know, being different because of climate change. If we connect with people's values and we connect with their everyday lives, we can tell stories that people really want to hear and really want to be part of. You know, we find that people are really supportive of a move towards clean energy. Yes, it has to be done right. Yes, we have to get much better at consultations and engaging people and putting things in the right place. But actually, like resoundingly, people think that putting solar panels on the roofs of car parks and homes is just like good common sense policy. You know, why are we not just doing that? We heard kind of time and again. And as I say, people are just fiercely proud of what we do to protect and restore natural places in the UK. So we gave people a sliding scale, 1 to 100. How proud are you of things that we do to protect our environment? You know, planting trees, stopping littering, conserving the land. You know, huge numbers of people talk about the pride that they feel in doing that. So to conclude, in difficult times, climate can't just be another thing for people to worry about. So to engage with the urgency that we know we have to, people have to see the potential for positive change. We have to keep reminding people change is already underway and you can be part of it and there can be more of it. And the best way to do that is to talk to people about the progress that we're making and to give them stories of tangible local benefits of people who are already doing things in their neighbourhood and ways that they can also get involved. And I have a brilliant feeling that a couple of the speakers you're about to hear from is going to really paint a picture of how we do that really well. Thank you.
Amazing. What a flying start, Rachel. I've got loads of questions, lots of thoughts. What we're going to do is hold on to those, folks. Put them into the Q&A if you have burning questions in your mind. What we're now going to do is hand over to Sofie Jenkinson from Round Our Way. Then we'll hear from Dominque Palmer and then Andrew McRobb, and then we'll have a good chat. Okay, over to you, Sofie. Thank you so much.
No worries. I'm just going to share my slides and also hope that they work. Are they working, Marianne? Yes. Okay, great. So yeah, I'm Sofie. I run Round Our Way with my co-director Roger, and we are specialists in communicating on climate impacts in the UK, and we do that to and with working class communities, especially older working class people who've been impacted, but also this is just an audience that often gets overlooked in a lot of classic climate communications. And as Rachel said, it maps on like fairly well. The segment, the Rooted Patriot segment that Rachel talked about, is the segment where people are most likely to identify as working class. So we use that as a little bit of a guide. And like we not only tell stories about climate impacts, but we make sure we give a platform and lift up the voices of people who've experience extreme weather and in lots of different ways. So flooding, issues around heat, wildfires, etc. And those lesser heard perspectives, just pushing them up into the media and across various different platforms, some of which I'll give you some examples on. Um, because like one thing that I really believe and will come out in this is that the stories we tell are really important, but who gets to tell the stories is just as important, not least because of what Rachel talked about on trust and people seeing themselves in the messengers, but also because it is right that we get to hear from lots of different kinds of people, and especially people who are already being impacted on our doorsteps by climate change. So part of the reason we do this is to build salience of climate in the here and now. A lot of people sort of think about climate and they see it as like a really far away issue, either in time or in like geography. So it's an issue they're worried about, but it's not here yet. It's not affecting people like them or communities they live in, like the communities they live in yet. And for a lot of people, that's just not true. I mean, for most of us, that's not true. So just sort of like showcasing that. And the other thing we do is, and someone mentioned this in the chat, is just try and close the perception gap that's happening in politics, which is the problem we have in politics is not public opinion on climate, as Rachel just showcased. It's across the board pretty strong. Even when you go down to policy level, it's pretty strong in terms of support, in terms of concern. But the views of politicians on what the public think is the problem. So they think that the public care less than they do. They think that especially so for people from working class backgrounds. And so moving at that and shrinking that perception gap is also part of what we do. And so I'll just take you through some examples of the type of work we do. And we do a lot of this in earned media, but not just in sort of print and broadcast media. We do it with a lot of different kinds of spokespeople, so fishers, farmers, footballers, GPs, midwives, mountain rescue, and we start our ideas and our brainstorming on ideas of the stories we tell from the perspective of what people care about, and then we link it to climate rather than starting with climate and linking it the other way. So, a bit of a whistle stop tour, but we've done quite a lot of stuff on food and farming, loads of stuff about food prices, but also about farmers' experience, issues with yields, issues with. So this farmer that you can see here, Richard, is based in North Yorkshire. He grows a number of things, including sugar beet, and he took us around his farm and showed us the potatoes that had rotted in the ground because of the flooding that is experienced. And he's a multi-generational farmer, and he can tell these great stories about how he's dealing with flooding in a different way from his granddad on the same farm. So we do loads of things with farmers and in lots of different kinds of stories, but this is just one example. And we do that across different kinds of food, and we try and find different hooks that are slightly unusual. And we've done the Valentine's Day chocolate and Easter chocolate story a couple of times. The Express often will cover that. We've done stuff on different meals like chicken tikka masala and Christmas dinner. We did pumpkins that had started to become really small. We did loads of stuff on carrots as well, which had risen in price more than anything else and become quite small too. We've also done a load of things around transport. So train cancellations and delays, potholes are getting happening more because of increased freeze thaw cycles. So we've done quite a lot on potholes and issues around that. And then we've done quite a lot on sport. So mostly on football, but we've done quite a bit on rugby in South Wales. We've done a load of stuff around flood alerts, just sort of showing how much more prevalent flooding is and how much more worrying it is for people because they're getting more alerts. We've done some stuff on water testing. So we got some people in communities to go and find some water and test it from a flood near them. And we just tested what was in it so we could show that the flood water in businesses and homes was basically disgusting. And ITV used disgusting filth as part of their headline. We've got a load of other things on heat. So it sort of like depends on the time of year. It's also quite weird working on weather because you sort of like you plan some stories and then the weather sometimes just doesn't play ball. So we planned a load of stuff on white Christmases not really happening anymore and then it snowed. So sometimes the weather doesn't always play ball because it's not a linear thing, as I'm sure you all know. But yeah, we've done loads of things around heat in classrooms, heat in the NHS and wards and maternity wards. overnight temperatures, so warm nights, not being able to cool off, how expensive SPF is when people are having to put more sun cream on, especially for kids, and actually even for dogs. We've done some stuff on hot dogs, and we had a vet talking about how, especially if you have a white animal, they sometimes need sun cream on their nose and ears, and you can't walk them at certain times of the day if it's really, really hot. We've done quite a bit on health. I mentioned maternity wards and heat, so we've done some stuff there. Extreme heat and health, and like hay fever seasons getting longer, for example. And then we've done loads of responsive work on heat waves, so health advice, but also what happens when people get stuck on holidays and there's wildfires, or you have to change where you're thinking about going on holiday because the heat in Europe is going to be much too hot for your family. And we're going to see an El Nino into the end of this year, so that's probably going to be more extreme in certain parts of the country, certain parts of the world next year. And then we've also got, we'll do a load of reactive work where we go on the news and talk about that. And we talk about, somebody, we've got someone on the news who was on holiday in Greece, and it was just, they had to be evacuated. So that's what a lot of the stuff we do in the media. So that's the sort of shape and type of story we do, which really centers like people in their lives and their communities, and the things that people care about in the day to day, like their homes, their families, putting food on the table, having fun and enjoying themselves. And one of the other ways we've done that is through our own podcast, which we did on community rugby in Wales, so grassroots sport in Wales. And a lot of the grassroots local rugby clubs in Wales are really struggling with extreme weather, and they're struggling with energy bills. So we had a partnership during this process with Bridgend Ravens, who are going to put a load of solar on one of their stands. They're paying £6,500 a month in energy bills at the moment, and they're really struggling. Like there's a lot of clubs that can't even heat their showers. So we're telling stories in really different ways. We're going into those clubs and talking to people, and as I said on the sort of perception gap, like most politicians would probably say to me, "Oh, you're going into a rugby club in Wales, nobody will want to talk to you about climate change." Not true. People do want to talk about that. They also just want to talk about like how much they love their club, and it's people don't think in like, I'm going to move into climate now. They're thinking about their community and what they care about, and what they want to protect. So we did a load of really interesting work around rugby, and it was a pleasure to do because it was just excellent. And then we've also got a Substack, which is just a library of longer form conversations, audio conversations mostly, with people who've been impacted. So there's all sorts of different people on there. Monroe at the top there, you can see, is a GP. We've got school students. We've got someone at Tadcaster FC there. You've got Pontypridd. You've got the mountain rescue guy in there somewhere down the bottom, and you've got midwives. So you've got like the sort of longer form stories of just people being able to tell their story of how climate change is already impacting them. And then almost finished, but just wanted to give you a little brief sort of view of part of the reason we tell stories this way. And you'll have seen a lot of different kinds of coverage in different kinds of papers, for example, is that if you tell a story well and you center the audience of that paper, you can often get stories about climate, about things that wouldn't necessarily be covered by a certain outlet in a paper, even though their editorial line is like anti-net zero. And that's because you're centering the sort of audience. So, you might have a Telegraph piece that talks about anti-net zero, but they'll also cover our stuff about hot classrooms. You might have pieces in the Times that do the same, but they'll also cover the stuff we've done on sport. Same in the Express. Steph Spire at the Express is amazing. She's a political journalist, and she does climate, and she will always cover our stuff. But actually, if you read their editorials, it's sort of at odds. And so part of what we're doing is like, we're going from like trying to make the sort of media makes out that it's just like you're either a denier or you're like a super extreme activist. And actually, the majority of people in the country are in this common sense middle space where people care about it, they're concerned about it, and they want to see action. And creating that sort of space for action to happen is really important. So, like, that is sort of where we're at, which is like, not everyone's a skeptic, not everyone's an activist. Actually, most people are in this space where they really care about this, and they want to make sure that stuff is okay for future generations and for their families now and in the future. So that is about it, really. And I think we'll probably come to questions on it, but just a very quick whistle stop tour. So there's a lot in there. So hopefully that does the trick.
Fabulous. Thank you, Sophie. Thank you so much. We're going to hand over now to Dominique.
Thank you, Marianne. Hi, everyone. Great to be here with you. I have not got slides. You'll just have to watch me speaking. And I'm looking forward to chatting with you all, and especially going into the questions. I saw there've already been like questions coming through. So yeah, a lot to go through. So I will just get started. So if you don't know who I am, my name is Dominque Palmer. I am a climate justice advocate and author, and I have a particular focus on mobilising and engaging young people, business leaders and politicians. So my advocacy, I would say, or activism, is really a love letter to the earth and all that we can save, because I truly do believe that every fraction of a degree, every win, every rewilded space, every campaign for climate justice matters, and it is truly having an impact. And as a young person who really started in this movement in 2019, I saw how young people were part of leading one of the largest environmental movements in history. And even with so little resources and so quickly, how many people were able to be mobilized. And even though it seems like that noise of these kind of climate strikes that happened after Greta Thunberg's sat outside of Swedish Parliament, even though it seems like that's kind of quieted down, or it might seem like climate in general in so many spaces and on a government level seems like it's not as much in the forefront, one thing that is really important for us all to remember is how the seeds that have been planted are still there, and lots of things are happening behind the scenes. So with the youth movement, for example, this has just transformed into different things. Lots of people I know are now working on incredible campaigns to really fight for climate and nature, and I'll talk a bit more about it later, but movements also aren't linear in that way. And the good thing is that we still have a possibility for the climate movement to also really have its highlight again and really have that noise and buzz around it again in the future. So my activism is based on the fact that we do have solutions, and what we actually need right now, as has been mentioned, is the implementation and the political will and the pressure on politicians so they understand how much the public care, and so there is no other choice but to take action. Because as we know, unfortunately, the scientific facts are not enough to actually move us to that green transition that we need. And this is why a lot of my advocacy now is focused on how do we get larger audiences of people, not just engaged and interested, but like actively involved in their communities and organising in whatever way that means for them, whether that is being part of local climate like community groups, being part of local like community gardens, whether that's writing letters, whether that's organising people to, you know, get together and meet with their local councillors or MPs, etc. So that is the energy that we need in order for us to make sure that we take the action for climate and nature, and also that we can hold the biggest polluters the biggest polluters accountable. I wasn't always this hopeful about the future though, so I'll just bring this back briefly. I started working on climate spaces being more inclusive back in about late 2018, as I felt that many times the focus would be purely on kind of reducing emissions and would really exclude the people aspect of it, and this real like justice aspect of it as well, why some people are affected more by the climate crisis than others, as others have already gone over in their presentations and covered that really well. And also how much inequalities are also at the very base of why we are seeing so much extraction and exploitation of our natural resources. And one of the first reasons that I got involved was due to air pollution. So I was living in South London at the time, I was about 18 years old, and I learned that the most deprived areas that are sacrificed to make room for roads and airports and polluting industries, and the areas that receive most of toxic pollution is mainly marginalized communities, and mainly people of color. And I also didn't see a lot of this kind of represented in the larger climate and nature space. And I also thought this is a really good opportunity to engage more people and get more people involved, because all of these things are so interlinked. And so from there, I began organizing the big climate strikes that happened, the youth climate strikes, and we managed to get, over 300,000 people to the streets in the UK. And it was a really amazing showing of how many people actually cared about the climate. And from there, I have now started speaking a lot and using my voice and making sure that people who didn't feel represented then started feeling quite inspired by seeing me talk about being a climate and nature advocate, and also bringing this reality to communities today, and showing people that climate encompasses so much: transport, fashion, food, clean air, water, housing, fashion, and so much more. And then it came to about this was in 2021, COP26, the United Nations Climate Change Conference that I went to. And, I was invited to speak there, I was invited to speak to world leaders. And after I left that, I felt such a huge sense of deep eco-anxiety and grief, because in my mind, this is where the action was going to happen. This was truly going to transform society. And this sense of eco-anxiety is something that's rising among everyone, but particularly in young people. And after that moment where, I felt so overwhelmed with the state of the world, I actually found that there were other ways that I could take action, and also that there was hope for the future. And with the movement and campaigners around me, I really found that way to build hope, and also found that I could include joy in the advocacy that I did, and find creative pathways of storytelling and messaging that would reach a broader audience. Like Rachael was talking about, a lot of communication being based on emotion and people feeling connected to you and what you're saying. And often the crisis can feel like the climate and biodiversity crisis can feel inevitable to a lot of people when I speak to them, rather than this is due to active decisions that are being made. And when you frame it like that, it brings back the agency and the feeling that, okay, if this is decisions, then we can take actions to influence those decisions and change them. And alongside millions of other people, that feels a lot more tangible. So I began working across areas such as youth empowerment, funding for climate and nature solutions, wildlife advocacy, and sustainable fashion. One thing I was part of was a Stop Rosebank campaign, where we won our court case against the government's decision to approve a huge oil field. And that is something that is still ongoing, but hopefully that will be stopped for good very soon. I'm a climate and nature bill ambassador, and I'm also a founding member of the Youth Climate Justice Fund and on the grants committee. And essentially this is making sure that young people across the world, and a diverse group of young people, actually have the resources they need to take the action. Because as I mentioned before, so many incredible people, like intergenerational, are doing amazing things for our planet with so little resources. And it's like, imagine if so much of that was actually diverted to where it needs to be. I'm also the fundraising coordinator of Climate Live UK, and so we use music to unite people, and we have a pink solar-powered bus stage that we bring to festivals across the UK in order to actually engage a wider audience of people, but also the music industry as well. And one example of a fun thing that we did was we had like a hot or not button feature at a festival about Rosebank, so the biggest proposed undeveloped field in the North Sea. That is the biggest one that's been proposed, and it was like, is Rosebank hot or not? And we actually used this to get more numbers for a public consultation about the oil field, and also to educate people more, because that's not something like talking about like an oil field or talking about energy transition isn't something that's as glamorous. And so we're trying to find fun ways to engage people with that. And I've also worked with artists such as Billie Eilish and meeting young fans where they're at. So we had like a conference that was called Overheated at one of her shows, and people kept coming back for the community that was built, because they felt there's other people around me that care and that they could actually do something. And the last thing I'll say before passing it on is that One thing that's really stuck with me lately is remembering that success is not linear. And when we look at movements, they always kind of have these, periods where you reach the peak and there's so much buzz about it. It's everywhere in the news and it feels like change is really happening. And then you reach moments like this where for a lot of people, it feels like it's not on the agenda anymore. But the good thing is that through some analysis, this kind of this lower point that we're at right now is still higher than the previous lower points we were at before. Essentially, that the seeds that have been planted and the momentum that has built has still made a good impact. And we would be in so much of a worse place if it wasn't for the amazing actions that have come before this moment now. So that's truly what's keeping me going, and also seeing all of the incredible solutions that people are really pushing forward, and see so many people like you all come together on a sunny Friday evening because you really care. And I think that just shows how much we can actually do. It's just about how we organize ourselves in the most effective way. But that's enough of me. I will pass on to the next speaker, and looking forward to getting into the panel.
Super. Thank you so much, Dominique. Yeah, that's a good point to remind us to be hopeful and have fun. Yeah, okay, let's talk about fun in a minute. I'm going to hand over now to Andrew. Andrew, over to you.
Hi, thank you very much. Welcome to everyone. And there's nothing worse than being the last speaker, in my opinion, because all the great orators, all the fantastic slides, and I'm now going to have to fill in. But I would say that many of the points that they've raised will come out in my very brief introduction as well. So mine's much more of a personal story. It's not a bigger stage. It's actually a personal story about what happens here in Herefordshire. I spent my informative years as a schoolboy in East Anglia, close to Grimes Graves, and I had the entirety of Thetford Forest as my playground, which was fantastic. My work background is in the commercial world rather than the charity world, and it took me all over the globe with luxury brands and merchandise. This included sourcing, negotiating licenses, distribution agreements, opening retail stores. I've learnt the hard way how cultures, communities, and individuals all put forward their objectives in different ways. And that's taught me the most important thing is listening. And I think that's come out previously in one of the things. You've got to be able to listen to other people's views. Really, really important. I moved to Herefordshire about 15 years ago and have renovated an old fruit farm. And today we have a small holding with a pedigree herd of Dexters and Tamworth pigs. I have a love of landscape and its protection, and that's what motivated me to join CPRE. And today I'm a director and trustee of CPRE Herefordshire. I sit on the Y Catchment Nutrient Management Board. I am also chair of the Y Catchment Partnership Steering Group, and I sit on the Malvern Hills National Landscapes Joint Advisory Committee. I've done that because of my passion for the environment and the way in which I think we need to move forward. In response to a very public knowledge of the pollution within the Y Catchment, I asked an innocent question at an environment agency and said, why is there no formal plan to help mitigate this? And the answer came back, they haven't got enough data. So in complete ignorance, I then said, well, we'll put boots on the ground and gather the data. It was a grand gesture and I had no idea how I was going to deliver it. But I'm pleased to say that along with some other partners, we did manage to put together a programme with the Environment Agency, Cardiff University and two other organisations. And we now are up and running. The Environment Agency was sampling on 40 sites once a month. So we thought, well, we can manage that. So we advertised for volunteers. I hoped we'd get 50 to do water testing. We actually got 500. Now, what that said to me was that people power is obviously there. We couldn't get 500 people to join CPRE, but we could get 500 people to give up once a week to go out in all weathers and sample water. And that was really, really filled me full of pride, to be absolutely honest. Because what we delivered then was 400 sampling points once a week. So the much needed spatial and temporal data was delivered. we recently took our 50,000th sample of water. Our data is used by the Environment Agency, and it now informs the Wye Catchment Plan, the Diffuse Water Pollution Plan, and many, many academic studies have come to us to use that data. It's free and available, open source for anyone to see and use. Climate change has had a significant impact on the rivers and the Wye Catchment through, well, in the past years, through low flow, increased temperatures, and algal bloom. Fish stress when the water temperature reaches 20 degrees C, and they die at 23 degrees. So we now realise that many of our actions have exacerbated this condition. Removal of shade, removal of floodplains, removal of hedges, all of this has amplified the effects of climate change. So that's why we've gone down this route, and a personal route of getting people involved to actually do something. We have 160 hedgerow heroes. We've been planting hedgerows for 2 years in Herefordshire, and they actually give us 3 fantastic benefits: wildlife corridors with shelter and food, carbon sequestration at 2 tonnes per kilometre per year. So that's a significant amount. We're already sequestered 28 tonnes of carbon, and that discounts even what the root balls do, because that's the above ground, and they actually hold more carbon than adjacent grassland. I've got great faith that if we can empower communities to do these small actions, these little steps can actually be of immense benefit to us and make a difference, because as previous people have said, often the problem appears to be too big and people just ignore it. There are many, many things we can each do that will actually impact it. One of the things when I give a lot of talks about this, because it'll probably come out in the conversations, well, what's causing the pollution? I always say, in actual fact, we have to leave blame and denial at the door. There's no point in actually trying to blame someone. We actually have to focus on the solutions and act collaboratively. Polarization, which we see in the press every day now, solves nothing. It is by working together that we can actually deliver. So, I heard the last speaker talk about joy and hope. There are days when my heart leaps because I think, gosh, we've achieved something. But there are days when I also think, crikey, I've been doing this for 5 years. We still haven't really got there. But my view is that people ask me, why do I do it? And the answer is simple, because if I don't, who's going to? So I believe that motivating people to do things is really, really important. So I'm doubtlessly going to be able to contribute later in the chat as we now go into discussion. But that just gives you a background how, as one person, I came into this, probably 10 years ago with a view to changing something in my own neighbourhood. Thank you.
Oh, lovely. Thank you so much, Andrew. That was definitely worth waiting for. I'm going to invite Rachael, Sofie, Dominque and Andrew into the chat. I'm struck, Andrew, by your final comment that I picked up a newspaper. It was like a radical press newspaper that someone had left on a train station. I picked it up and there was a kind of a full page print that said, if not now, when? If not us, who? And I was like, oh, it's speaking to me. So I cut it out and I've stuck it on our fridge. So it's a kind of a guiding message for every day. Okay, folks, we've got some questions in the chat. But what I want to pick up first of all is a thing that has been touched on by lots of you, that we live in this outrage economy, that polarization, the kind of the rage moment is the thing that gets a press story into the papers. Or Sofie, for example, I guess even, that the pumpkins are tiny and your chicken curry is really expensive. The invitation is for me to be angry about that. How do we kind of get past the anger, or is the anger useful? Sofie, let's go to you first.
Not anger necessarily, but I think, and this sort of speaks to what Rachael was talking about in terms of knowing who your audience is. So, increasing fatalism is really easy, like making people feel like there's no point and they can't do anything about it. especially for really engaged people. So your progressive activists, for example, you wouldn't want to be like dialing up the fatalism there. But for people who care about climate change, when you talk to them about it, it's in the mix, but it's not like going to be the first thing they mention or in the top three issues that they say are important. A little bit of salience raising on like these things are happening and they're happening now is, I guess, a little bit of an invitation to like be a bit more worried about it. But it's not just about that it's happening, it's about that it's happening here and that things like this need political action. So the sort of end of our sentence will always be like, we want to see more political action on this to reduce emissions and to adapt to the impacts we're seeing. So like to create the conditions for consent and for political action, and to shrink that gap that what politicians think the public think and what the public actually think. You need to sort of like raise it up, like the salience, because like the amount of stuff that people see and are absorbing every day is just like relentless, relentless, relentless. And a lot of that stuff is, the same thing every day, like small boats, small boats, small boats. So like that's going to be further up the list of what people say they're thinking about because they're hearing about it all the time. So, you're in a sort of like a sort of attention like economy, and just making sure that the things that we want people to talk about and like show concern about are in the mix is sort of part of it. But like to your original point on like polarization, I think that's part of the reason for talking about it in a more normal way like that. Like pumpkins for Halloween are smaller this year is a different kind of vibe from very outraged sort of like everything's awful about this net zero, awful net zero thing. It's a more common sense like where people actually are on the whole.
And I guess it means as well that people go, is it just me? Are these pumpkins a bit smaller than they were last year? And actually it kind of demonstrates that, yes, this is a thing. This is a thing and it's a systems thing, not just is it just me thing.
Yeah, exactly.
Rachel, so we're talking about that kind of perception gap between what politicians think people want, particularly, for example, certain segments, and then what people actually want. And we see the survey data, we see the polling. You talk to a kind of citizens' assembly that is demographically, balanced and representative of the nation. And what they would advocate in terms of policy and action is so much more ambitious and progressive and kind of, whoa, scary. But then you kind of look at what the politicians choose to do and they're dialing it down. They're saying, oh, well, that would lose us votes. Maybe, I mean, I'm not in those conversations, but it just feels like their interpretation is tepid, so tepid sometimes, and fearful of not going too quick or upsetting too many people. Why they see that same polling, they see the same survey results, so why does that not land for them?
Great question. If I knew the answer, then I'd be busy fixing. I think it's a bunch of things. There was some really interesting data published quite recently about the difference in the views of Conservative voters and Conservative MPs about support for our net zero targets. So amongst Conservative voters, support for our net zero targets has basically stayed the same for the last 3 years. It's maybe dropped by like 3 or 4%. Amongst Conservative MPs, it's absolutely fallen off a cliff. That's about politics. That's because, in this country, we were really lucky for a really long time. We had a kind of cross-party consensus about the need to tackle climate change. Big pieces of important legislation were passed by Conservative governments and supported by Labour oppositions and supported by smaller parties. Like, this was seen as being kind of too important to be about politics. And that's changed. And this is now seen as something that kind of politicians, political parties can use to kind of drive wedges between different people and different voters. And partly that's politics. I don't like it, but like, let's not pretend that that isn't what it is. And I think partly it is about like, this is where the rubber's hitting the road, right? We're not in the era of setting really difficult to set, but like setting big ambitious targets. We're in the business of delivering them, and we're in the business of delivering them in an economy that isn't growing, where people's lives are getting harder, where tough choices are being made by people every single day. And if you as a politician think you can, stir some things up, again, I wish that didn't happen, but I think like we need to be honest about the world we live in, not the world that kind of we would like to live in. I think the other thing is the kind of post-bag effect. So you ask MPs, like, what do you think support is for renewable energy projects? And they'll say, oh, no, there's hardly any support, because what they often hear about is people who are raising concerns. Those concerns may be really valid. Those concerns need to be listened to. Politicians need to go and engage with those people. But there's a whole bunch of people who aren't writing those letters. And there are people who will be much more like supportive, or kind of, a lot of people are a bit like, yeah, you know, I like it that I've got a fridge that works. So like, we need to power it somehow. So yeah, like, can I have some electricity, please? Some people are really passionate. Some people really care. But I think it's also kind of saying to MPs, like, the people who take the time to write to you are not representative of your entire constituency. And I think the job of some kind of advocates is to just, again, kind of point out where, you know, the rest of the kind of majority are, and kind of keep banging that drum. But final point, like, this isn't exclusive to climate, right? And I think this happens on all different policy issues, and, you know, about a government's willingness to be bold and progressive and optimistic, like that we're not just seeing, you know, kind of limitations sometimes on that in some policy areas. So I think, like, it's also kind of important to take a kind of step back and be like, what is the overall, like, vibe and the mood of different political parties and kind of where we're going, rather than being like, this is particularly acute for climate, because I don't think it is.
That's such a good point, isn't it? Yeah. That it's not a conspiracy to deny climate. It's just also one of the victims of this.
Can we dig
go on.
dig a bit deeper on this one? Because I think that what we haven't touched on is the Yes Minister effect. And it may not be as familiar with people, but I've personally had several meetings with the Deputy Minister of the Senate and the Water Minister, Emma Hardy, and where things have been agreed, you know, and things are going to happen. A year later, when nothing's happened and we rattle the cage, you find that everything's stuck in the civil service, and they are not carrying out with speed the things that have actually been asked to do. And this has become very, very obvious over a whole series of issues in the White Catchment, over funding for plans and for research. And you realise that it isn't the minister, because every time we speak to the minister, she puts a boot up the backside of DEFRA and something happens. But I think there is a real issue with our civil service in terms of being able to enact. And of course, it's all very well to be critical of ministers, but they have such wide portfolios now with so many things that are pressurizing them. And I think that ministers themselves won't solve this. There is a big issue with how we get the type of civil service and government that should react to all these things that, you know, we've heard about, and they're just not.
It's a theme that's come up quite a lot in the chat, as much as I've been able to kind of keep on top of it. Dominque, I don't know if you've got thoughts on this, that often that, you know, kind of when you look at how government is working and how these conversations actually play out, it often ends up quite siloed, and people are either talking to their tribe about a really specific issue. And the point that you were saying, actually, climate isn't just about climate or meteorological conditions, or even, you know, it's about fashion, it's about music, it's about where you go on holiday, it's about the food you're eating, it's about public transport. That's come up quite a lot. How do we get that join up? And is there a risk that when you're telling that more kind of interwoven story, that people lose the thread and they think that you're talking about fashion when actually you're also talking about climate, but they remember the fashion bit but not the climate bit?
Yeah, that is a really good point. And I think one thing that I have been feeling a lot more recently, especially with this, you know, growing divide and everything that we've been talking about earlier, and like, what are people concerned about on their day to day, is actually sometimes, depending on who you're talking to, meeting people where they're at can also mean not outright saying, I'm talking about climate, but you are talking about green energy, or you are talking about transport, you are talking about clean water. For example, I remember I was speaking up like a lot about sewage being, you know, pumped into our rivers. And from conversations I had with people, I remember an event I went to, and one of the reasons they got involved was actually not because of, you know, the environmental like activism or, you know, climate advocacy, but the thing that actually got them more hooked was the fact that their kids could get sick swimming in this river. And I think it's all these little things that actually hook people in more, because I think one thing I've learned over time is that even just saying to people, we are in a climate emergency, even if people accept it and they're not a climate denialist, it may not actually move people more towards that point of action. So we want that engagement, but we also need the action, because that is like people doing what they can, because that is when we actually get that pressure on politicians. So yeah, it's a really good question. And I think it really depends who you're talking to in that way. And I found that sometimes not mentioning climate at all, but talking about very clear things that we need for a sustainable future to actually be quite effective. Right. But of course, we also need to keep climate in our messaging at the same time. So it's a delicate balance.
Right. Folks, we've got so many brilliant questions from the audience. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn to those, and whoever wants to answer, go. Okay, so Louisa says, there's been a tendency to direct climate education at children. Is there a risk that this might give the impression that we can afford to wait until they grow up to take action? And I'm going to add, with chair's privilege, addendum to say, or that it's like a kind of a children's concern and that the grown-ups aren't in the room.
Yeah, I'm happy to go forward on this. Yeah. Thanks, Rachel. So I recently wrote a children's book about protecting the planet. And one of the main kind of threads I wanted to have in there is I want the next generation to feel like empowered, to feel like there's actually something that's being done. And I used it mainly to talk about what action so many different young people were taking, but also with the caveat that it's not all on their shoulders to be doing this. This was aimed at 9 to 12-year-olds, you know. Don't want to tell 9-year-olds that it's all up to them to save the planet, because that's what a lot of us in the youth movement went through, and it caused a lot of mental health issues on me as well. I felt so pressured because every time I do an event or every time I do a campaign, adults, because I was a teenager at the time, would always tell me it's up to you. This is your time. You need to be the one that is taking us where we need to go. And that is way too much pressure, but also it really is an intergenerational thing. And I think it's two things. I think it's firstly that children and young people deserve to know what's going on, so they don't get to an age where they realize there's a climate crisis like I did, and then all of this starts flooding in. And also that it's not kind of in the back of their heads, because for a lot of them, they do know there's a crisis, but they don't quite understand what's going on. And that can be even worse than actually having more knowledge about it. And then, yeah, so making sure there's the education, but then on the second part of it, making sure that we are directing the action towards those in power and towards, adults in society who have the resources, the time to take action.
I think also, just to add to that, like it is really important that it's an intergenerational conversation, as Dominique says. And I think, there's a lot of message testing around that will talk about like future generations messaging, which does okay in like isolation. But if you make it personal to people and people talk about their own situation, their own kids, their own families, like it works a lot better. And I think, intergenerational conversations about like, your grandkid might not see any white Christmases, or might have to deal with like 45-degree summers, and that is like a really like stark thing. And kids having those conversations upwards, but also the adults and older people like taking responsibility for that and feeling that sort of like burden of responsibility, which I think a lot of people do. I think sometimes it's just about how to have that conversation. It can feel quite overwhelming. Like on the podcast we did, there was a lot of people who were like, I almost feel embarrassed that I don't know how to talk about this, and like making people feel more comfortable about talking about it. So like I think there is like, obviously there is a danger that it makes it look like we're just like passing that on to the next generation. But I think if we all take it seriously as adults, and we have enough leaders in different generations and make sure it's truly intergenerational, then I think that would help with that.
Right. Okay. Do you agree that the Climate and Nature Emergency Briefing looks like being one of the most important initiatives to alert everyone to the seriousness of the situation? Could CPRE, Round Our Way and Climate Outreach collab with the National Emergency Briefing team to promote the film? So thoughts on the national emergency briefing and whether it's hitting hard, hitting big? Rachel?
So I love the ambition of what the National Emergency Briefing is trying to do. I think it's run by people, and they are being really driven and passionate about trying to get kind of really important messages out. And I think the notion of inviting people to set up film screenings and inviting communities to come in, watch that film together, feel some connection, have an MP there if they can, and kind of do that sort of local accountability. I think it's a wonderful model, and I think there's loads and loads of screenings happening around the country. I haven't seen the film. One of my concerns about the kind of framing of it is it goes to that, we're going to scream some big scary facts at you. And I really hope that the community film, because I saw the National Emergency Briefing that happened in Parliament that was pretty facts and stats heavy. There weren't many people, there wasn't much storytelling to kind of counter some of that. And I really hope, I've had a couple of conversations with the organisers, that the community film does manage to bring that in, because my only concern would be if all it does is kind of terrify people sitting in that room, then I don't think we're going to get the kind of momentum and the follow-up and the next steps that we need. And I think that's how you get, not just the people who are event organisers and already committed and already passionate. That's how you get people who wouldn't normally go and watch a film like that, is if they can see the brilliant footage of Pam, who was part of the Citizens Assembly and had never thought about this before, and then has a brilliant story and talks about how she's now kind of converted to eating less meat and things. Like, that's how you multiply. So I really hope the film manages to do that. But I think that model of kind of inviting people to come together is something that we're really missing in communities. And I think the more that we can do that, the better.
Yeah, sorry, go on, Andrew.
So I was going to say, I'd sort of add to that, and also to the concept of families talking together. One of the big things that I think is missing, and we need to increase, is getting people out into the countryside. It's all very well to talk in theory about climate change, or, as you say, show them a scary film, but it's so important to get people to understand nature. Get them to understand the beauty of the countryside and how we should be protecting, the wildlife and everything that goes with it. I think if you do that, then particularly at a young age, that lives with people for their entire life. It becomes something that's it's not just an in theory. They can actually then practically refer to the items. So you might say, well, as CPRE, I would say that, wouldn't I? But I do think it's really important to get more people out into nature, even if it's in urban farms, anything, parks, just to understand how important the protection of this and the impacts of climate change on it.
Yeah.
Sophie, oh sorry, who's
it's just me. I want to quickly add on that.
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, completely agree, Andrew. One thing, before I became an advocate for climate and nature, I didn't feel that huge connection to nature around me, because I didn't have access to quality green spaces or kind of know where to go. And it wasn't, also, if you don't live in areas where live near the countryside, or where you're often going on trips to it, sometimes you can feel very disconnected. And I found that actually learning more about what was around me, and now being in a place where I feel so connected to nature, and I am an advocate for wildlife, has now really cemented that within me and in people that I know as well, who previously wouldn't consider themselves really nature people. And I think, there's also a conversation about access and some of the really great organisations that are trying to get more young people actually out into nature where they don't otherwise have access or aren't, able to go there.
Sophie, do you have thoughts on this? From your work with working class communities, do the stories play out differently whether people are live in urban places or live in rural places? Because obviously the CPRE is the campaign to protect rural England, but what happens in towns and cities affects what happens in the countryside. And of course, we need everybody, regardless of where you live, or where you feel like your home is, to care about the countryside, because what happens over there affects you regardless.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, people have like different experiences, and although often people will have grown up in different, like I live in London, but I grew up in Shropshire, so have like, you have connection to nature and like rural spaces from different parts of your life. But we, like I said, we work with farmers a lot, and someone said this in the chat, but like if you're in nature a lot and if you're a farmer and you're watching the weather every day and you're in the same sort of area every day, you notice things differently and you can sort of track the changes. Same for fishers to some degree. We live on an island. There's a lot of like blue space as well as green space. And it does like it lands differently in terms of like what people have experienced themselves and what they've noticed. And also just in terms of like how people think about class, because a lot of people would assume that um, well, it happens a lot in Westminster that you're only working class if you're northern, and also like if you live in certain parts of the country, not if you're coastal, not if you live in big cities, not if you live in Wales or Scotland, and so it's sort of been boiled down to like red wall seats and things like that. So, class is obviously like really complicated, but also not localized in one place. So how people experience their lives and how they feel about their place, as Dominique was saying, in different movements or in different conversations will also affect how different stories land with them, if that makes sense.
Yeah, how important is it, do you think, then from your research, and Rachel, you might have thoughts on this too, to have exactly what Andrew was describing, those kind of personal, visceral, tangible experiences to hook the stories onto? Can it be abstract or imagination led? You can put yourself in someone else's feet, the farmer's shoes, or does it need to be an experience that you have had yourself to
Well,
really land?
I think it if it is that, it's really powerful. And that is always really helpful. So like the stuff we've done on maternal mental health, not maternal health and heat, like people who've been through that and had their baby in the heat, it's like a visceral experience. But also as a parent, people can put themselves in those people's shoes. I think it's the trusted messengers and being able to see yourself in the messenger is really, really important. And I think that can be that the messenger, the person talking to you, is like you, or it can be that you identify with them in some way or you trust them in some way. Like farmers are really, really great storytellers in lots of ways, but they're often pillars of the community. They're seen as like leaders in rural spaces. So like doctors are the same, like people like paramedics, midwives. We've had like people who've worked with the RNLI or like mountain rescue, people who spend the time and go and do things for other people, like in sort of embody a trust in people. But I think if you can connect with something visceral in people, sure. But I think that people who've had that visceral experience get to tell their story is also as important as people who've had it hearing it, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Okay, cool. I'm writing notes. Hang on. Trusted
It's
visceral storytelling. Nice.
as someone who got trapped on a bus during a London heatwave when I was 38 weeks pregnant, I kind of got a bit of but definitely a physical reaction to that anecdote. So I think the other thing that I've found really like exciting in the last couple of years is watching people who work in the kind of culture space really think about how do we do kind of climate content differently. So like documentaries are great, asking whether kind of readers to talk a bit more about the weather and connecting it to climate, like that's really important. But actually the program that's had most cut through about climate change, when you ask most people in the last couple of years, is Clarkson's Farm, because that's someone experiencing, someone who used to be a bit skeptical about climate change, seeing it every day and like talking about what it means, and people, that will come up when you kind of ask people about it. But like the producers of the soaps are thinking about how do you kind of subtly have a character getting a heat pump, which isn't a big climate klaxon, it's just a normal thing that someone did. They got a heat pump in their home. And I think again, like the more there are just bits of those stories and bits of that content that kind of, to some of your points, Dominique, like this isn't a climate thing, it's just a heating my home well thing, or it's just a, you know, someone who's going to secondhand shops rather than shopping on, you know, websites from China. Like, again, we're not pointing a big climate lens at it, but just that's just a normal thing that people are doing. So other people are going, do you know what? Yeah, that's, and I think that kind of shift in some of the climate content is really exciting, and there's lots more that can be done there, I think.
Aha, amazing. Okay, let's Roger Mortlock, who is the Chief Executive of CPRE. Hi, Roger. Thanks for joining us at your own event. Amazing presentations from the panelists. Well done, you guys. All organisations have a particular role to play, he says. I wonder, what do you think the particular role of CPRE should be? You get to answer live, and then I and our chair and trustees and staff team go. What should CPRE do, the Campaign to Protect Rural England? Andrew, you get to go first because you're a trustee of the network branch.
Well, I'd like to go on last on this one, but you know, let's say I think CPRE.
We could skip you if you don't. If I don't.
Yeah, no, I think CPRE has to stand tall and actually work tirelessly to actually protect and promote the countryside. And you know, it was something was touched on earlier. I have conversations with groups all around the country, and no one wants solar farms, no one wants windmills, no one wants oil, no one wants nuclear, but every single one of those people wants to turn a switch on and their lights to come on and their computer to work and power their phone. And I think it's the message we've got to get across is that we have to work together. There's got to be compromise. There's got to be solutions that we all can sign up to, because without that, we won't make the progress. And it's really, really important that we listen to other people's views. I've said that earlier, and I think that's key. And we don't react just because we don't agree with it. We have to put reasoned arguments to say, well, is there a better way of doing something? So, you know, that's where I think our role is listening and finding solutions.
Some people love those turbines. Some people like the glint of solar panels. But we'll move on. In my screen, Sophie, have you got thoughts? What should CPRE do?
I really agree with Andrew. I think compromise is really important, and just like knowing that we're all, you know, living on this island together and working together towards something better for all of us is really important. And having people who are strong leaders in like rural and countryside spaces being advocates for like climate transition in ways that are, you know, respectful to communities and meaningful conversations where people are listened to, because, you know, consultation matters, and people should be able to you know, really be heard. But you know, I don't think that the language that the government uses on blockers and things like that is particularly useful. I think it's, you know, it's more about compromise. I also agree with Rosalind in the chat, which is just like normalizing behavior, like normalizing and like socializing the like sensible climate common sense behavior. Like, it's not a really extreme thing to think to want to do these things to protect these places. I think it's a really important role to play, that CPRE probably already plays that role, but like doing it more and more, visibility of that and of the action is a really important role, I think.
Great, thank you. Rachel.
I think you have a hard job, but a vital job. Because there is disagreement on some of this. There's a lot of agreement, and we need to keep kind of going back to that. But like, this does, you know, get challenging and difficult, especially kind of really passionately in some local places. And I think as CPRE, like, you're one of the few organisations who is often really trusted, and quite often trusted on like both sides of the argument, and that must make your job hard. But there's few organisations who can do that, and I think your role is as kind of holding both those sides, trying to kind of help find a way through. Like holding the space for people to disagree well, right? It's really important that we do that, and we seem to have kind of forgotten that that's important, and sort of thinking about how we find common ground. My first ever job was working for Shelter, and one of the first things I did was worked with the CPRE on a campaign for more affordable housing in the countryside, and that seemed like we seemed like unnatural bedfellows, but it was a really good thing to do, and it was a surprising thing to do, and like that really stays with me as something that I think is quite sort of unique to what the CPRE's role could be.
Great, thank you. And Dominique, thoughts? Who should the CPRE be? What should we do?
Big question. I really agree with what's been said, and I think now that we are also seeing some attacks on net zero in the media, and more, attacks on climate action as a whole, I think continuing to support what we need to do to protect our nature, to protect the countryside. And as has been mentioned, you have such, a great audience of people on all different sides and from all different backgrounds. And I think we're also pushing forward that messaging that there's so much that we can gain from taking action and from restoring our environment. Because a lot of people, as was said earlier, continuously think, oh, they're just going to tell me to do this, or there's so much danger or unknown about a green transition, and actually really pushing that we have so much to gain, and that being protecting the beautiful nature around us. And then lastly, to continue to have a diverse and intergenerational board, and those who contribute to the direction of CPRE. And I think you guys are doing a brilliant job.
Amazing. Thank you so much. Folks, it's the end of our time together. I could talk to you lot for ages, but I have to let the good people go. Thank you so much, folks, for putting in so many good questions. I'm sorry that we couldn't get to more of them. Thank you to Andrew McRobb, Sofie Jenkinson, Rachael Orr and Dominque Palmer. Thank you so much for joining us. Don't forget, folks, we have recorded this session and we'll share that link with you so that you can share it wide. Follow up on any of the links we will send to you afterwards. This is the last webinar of the spring series, but you can catch up on the previous 2 episodes. We will share a link for that as well, featuring Rob Larter, Dieter Helm, what's his chops from the IPCC? Oh, God. Yeah.
I think you'll like that. I'd love it if I was just known as What's Her Chops from Climate Outreach. Like, I think that's a promotion.
Not you. No,
I know, but I'm saying I think that's a win, right?
Or Jim, Professor Sir Jim Skier, that guy. Sorry, everyone. Sorry, Jim. You'll take it on the chin, I'm sure. So do catch up on those, and then of course you can rewatch this one. Final plug: CPRE have just published a book. Hang on. Oh, I've got to put it in front of my face. No, doesn't want to see it. Oh no, there you go. Future Rural, imagining tomorrow's countryside. So entirely speaking to what we've talked about tonight about finding space for disagreeing well, for finding the common ground and agreeing that compromise is the way forwards, and that the difficult questions and the difficult conversations with unlikely bedfellows are the ones that are going to get us much further, much faster towards a much more livable future. Thank you again. If you would like to know more about the current CPRE campaigns, head over to our website, sign up for a newsletter, join up with policy, and hey, if you want to, become a member. We would love that. If not, if being a member of a thing isn't your thing, but you still want to get your boots on the ground and your fingers in the river, then contact one of your local branches, and we've got lots of opportunities to get involved. Online activists campaigning, policy specialists, planning work, but also planting hedgerows, counting wildflowers, mowing meadows, and doing citizen science in the rivers and the streams and the lakes around you. I'm going to stop there. I'm going to wish you all a very, very good evening, and I hope to spend more time with you again soon. All right, good night, folks.